While we're waiting for people just to join this webinar, Luke, if you wouldn't mind, could you just briefly introduce yourself, talk about your background and what you do at Brookes and with Wales as well? Thanks.
Of course, yeah. So currently I'm a senior lecturer in sports coaching at Brookes University alongside yourself, Paul. And then in addition to that, I am the head of physical performance for the Welsh Football Association. So I travel with our senior women's squad primarily, and I've been there for about 18 months. Prior to that, I did 2 years with the New Zealand Football Association and then about 8 or 9 years with the English Football Association. And then before that, club football at various clubs throughout the country. So a lot of football-based S&C, but I've worked across about 12 sports, providing strength and conditioning provision from your traditional kind of hockey, cricket, rugby, down to your more kind of alternative sports, para-tri, goalball, judo, sprint canoe. So a little bit of a varied background in terms of S&C provision, but yeah, excited to share some thoughts this evening.
Excellent. Thanks for that. So just for people that maybe this is your first webinar that you've joined of this format. So what we usually do is I've taken questions that have come to me via email and on social media prior to the webinar. So we'll go through those with Luke, but this webinar, because it's quite a niche area in terms of we're looking at football, and the reason I've done that is like with the last webinar is obviously it coincides with the World Cup, so it's a little bit of a World Cup theme we've got going on. So Luke's kindly offered and to produce a couple of slides just to explain what this the theme of this webinar is and his philosophy. So if you wouldn't mind, Luke, if you could share your slides with us, and then we can make a start on the presentation.
Share screen. Just let me know you can see that, Paul.
Yep, we've got that. Yep, brilliant.
So let me just get this up. 1 sec. Sorry, guys. Pull up bottom. Just move that. Sorry, it's been a while since I've used this. Almost there. Just go with that. Sorry, guys. I'm just trying to find my presenter view. There we go. Perfect. Right. So
brilliant. Thanks.
Sorry about that. So essentially, what we're going to talk about today is fitness for football. And when Paul asked me to do this, I was very aware that this is kind of an open-ended conversation that we essentially could have done weeks and weeks of webinars on. So I just wanted to kind of pick a few bits that were essentially relevant to this topic, but hopefully will stimulate some of the questions we've already had come through and then potentially start stimulating some further questions as we go along. But ultimately, we want our athletes or football athletes, essentially, if we're training them through potentially an aerobic development type modality, we want to increase the capacity of the oxygen transport system, the capacity of the muscle to utilize oxygen during prolonged periods of exercise, increasing the ability to recover after high intensity exercise, and then ultimately just increasing our economy as our athletes so that they're requiring to exert less effort to get more of an outcome. So what we're going to cover today, like I said, I'm going to give a little bit of a brief intro. We're going to go through some example sessions, so just some examples of some drills that I've potentially used in the past, and then where I want to spend, or we want to spend, hopefully most of our time is that Q&A towards the end around fitness of football, and hopefully more broad than that, kind of all things S&C in sport, anything that I mentioned during the next kind of 10 minutes or so, anything you've been thinking about in terms of the applied setting of strength and conditioning that you want to ask a practitioner, feel free to go for it. In terms of a philosophy, again, I could have spent a lot of time talking about that, but for me, working with footballers and having done so for the last 15 years, the big thing for me around is the path of least resistance. So those traditional training modalities that we'll go on to, when I first started working in sport, cross-country runs seemed to be quite au fait or in fashion. We used to take to, I think it's 2007, I worked in academy football. We would take lads on long, 8 to 10K runs through the woods. And it was very much like the norm. That is very much changed. And the kind of demands on our athletes now have changed in terms of the intensity of the game, and also ensuring we keep players on side and the buy-in we have. Ultimately, it's trying to make it as most effective in the most efficient amount of time. And that's kind of linked to this point here around getting more bang for our buck. So what can we do that will elicit, in this instance, an aerobic development idea, as well as potentially, some sort of repeated speed or a tactical technical element to what we're going to do, opposed to just being this standalone element. Our training time is finite with these athletes. You might get 90 minutes a day if you're a full-time athlete on the training field. It might be 90 minutes twice a week if you're working with a part-time type sports team. So again, fitness for football, we could have talked all day about various things: speed, strength, aerobic capacity, power, flexibility, mobility, and then our tactical technical capabilities. Again, we're going to focus around that aerobic capacity, but having in the back of our mind that these athletes need to developing all these things concurrently. So that definitely needs to come into our thought processes. And then linked to that again is, whose responsibility is this? So we might think, oh, well, fitness training or S&C, that lies solely with the strength and conditioning coach. Potentially, yes, but then knowing that everything that the athlete does in addition to this can have a big impact on the development or the capacity that we can develop. So a really strong and effective multidisciplinary team approach to that, with the athlete in the middle, who's the little figure putting the last piece of the puzzle in, is going to be so important. I've worked in environments where teams or staff groups are really, really cohesive and communication is really, really effective, and we're all on the same page in terms of everything we give the athlete as a cost. So is that cost taking us towards our end goal? Whereas I've also been in environments where lots and lots of messages are going into the athlete, asking them to do lots and lots of different things, whether that be the physio, the sports scientist, the S&C coach, the psychologist, the nutritionist, technical coach, and it overloads the athlete, and then they're unable to focus on ultimately what the end goal is, and that is ultimately performance. So I think this kind of picture gives you a little bit of an idea around, so this is our international athlete. I spend a lot of time with my international athletes. So all of these members of staff can be having an impact on them, as well as their family and friends from the outside world and their club. We ultimately need to be having lots and lots of interdisciplinary conversations to ensure that we've got that athlete's best interest at heart, and we know that where our performance kind of aims are, opposed to being in that siloed approach. So if we're all just sat in our little hubs, collecting our data and being really effective with our data, then that's great, but it will sit on a database and potentially won't make an ounce of difference to our athlete. So once we've got an idea of, okay, what are we trying to achieve, we probably need to know what are the demands of our sport. From a literature standpoint, there's been an male kind of Premier League international GPS data has been collected for a number of years. The female game's sort of catching up with that now, but we know of late that there's been a lot more data collected. This one here gives us a little bit of an outline from the men's game. And I think it's a really interesting thing, particularly around, we've seen that it's a similar distance covered across our central midfielders, our wide midfielders and our attackers, but it's that high intensity and that sprint distance that massively changes between our athletes. So when I spoke earlier on about our economy, so being more economical in what we're able to do from an aerobic standpoint, that lower intensity work, we want to tax the athlete less. So when it comes to that high intensity work or that sprint work, there's more energy available to it to be able to complete those actions and complete those actions successfully. And as you see, that 6-season increase in high intensity running, essentially the professional men's games drastically increased. We've seen that athletes are covering less distance but at a higher intensity. And again, if you have been following the World Cup, again, you would see that it's much more transitional, much more counter-attacking style of play, particularly from our lesser nations. Canada did it really well against Belgium, didn't get the result, but it was a phenomenal kind of physical display of that counter-pressing, counter-attacking type style. In terms of the women's game, where I spend a little bit more of my time, this report came out from 2019 in the last World Cup, and essentially found that the data indicated that England were able to sustain their physical capacity as a team across 7 games. There was less of a drop-off from the English team than pretty much any other nation. And the data kind of came out around this worst case scenario. So for around 3 minutes of work, athletes were required to do approximately 140 meters a minute. If all of us on this call now try to run 140 meters a minute without any tactical or technical demands on us, I'd like to think we'd all be pretty comfortable. A football pitch is approximately 100 meters long, so just under 1.5 pitch lengths in a minute. It's not going to be too taxing on us. Add in those repeated sprints, those changes of direction, those short kind of bursts of energy is showing us where we need to spend our time in terms of physical development. So that gives us an idea of where we want to get to in terms of our end result, in terms of match demands. Then we're going to think about, okay, what are all the elements that we can have on us within a training week? So from Walker and Hawkins, I think this is a really nice way of looking at it, and kind of ideas for you guys to think about, okay, how can I develop my athletes physically? And we know we've got our intensive football, intensive soccer, those 1v1s, those 2v2s, those small-sided games, where we're overloading those acceleration, deceleration, change of direction tasks on our athletes, overloading them potentially mechanically in terms of load through our limbs, through particularly eccentric contractions when we are having to decelerate or accelerate. Then we've got our extensive modalities, again, potentially more aerobically based, 7v7, 10v10s, larger pitch sizes, larger areas. And then we've got those kind of other elements that we need to consider. Exposure to max velocity. We know that if we're not exposing our athletes regularly to sprinting, we're increasing their injury risk. Our high intensity interval running, which we're going to talk about very shortly. Then our speed endurance and our repeated sprint drills. Having an idea of where these might fit within a training week is going to be so important. This is a kind of a typical game week for a professional team who play Saturday to Saturday. Saturday game, Sunday off, Monday they're in for some kind of extended recovery, and then we have these acquisition periods. So traditionally Tuesday, Wednesday, where we can put some load for our athletes, and maybe some speed-based drills, some conditioning-based drills, where we're trying to get some development from our athletes in season. And then we're starting to taper for our game at the weekend. So have that in mind, hopefully when it comes to the question and answers towards the end, and also when I'm going to give some example sessions shortly around, okay, how does that actually fit? So how do our sessions actually fit within a training week? Because it's great that we can plan effective sessions, but it's how those little pieces of the puzzle fit into our jigsaw of a training week with an athlete. So linked to that would be the fact that our athletes are concurrent in nature. So our athletes, we ask them to be an aerobic based athlete. If we think about footballers, anywhere between 8 and 12k, we can see our athletes competing. Also being a strength based athlete, lots of short, sharp acceleration, decelerations, and also a power based athlete, jumping, landing, sprinting. So we're having to ask our athletes to do all of these things simultaneously. So potentially traditional training modalities of those long cross-country runs that we mentioned might not be the most effective. So some of Blagro's work in and around concurrent training is essentially found that intermittent aerobic athletes will need to still have these facets of strength, power, and speed within their training program. If we just trained aerobically, we'd get great aerobic development, but we wouldn't have anything from our strength power side, and vice versa. If we just had strength power activities, we wouldn't get any of that aerobic development, and we wouldn't be able to cope with the demands of our sport. So what we're trying to think about is, what is our end goal? What does a match play look like? And how do we kind of work back from that to ensure that we're training our athletes specifically for that? So those traditional training modalities, which I've kind of alluded to, are those kind of, we could go out 20 to 60 minutes in lower than 80% of our VO2 max if we knew what that was. And we would get an aerobic adaptation to it. We find that potentially that has an impact, potentially positive impact on performance, because we're increasing our capacity, making it potentially more economical, but it isn't specific to the demands of the sport, what we're actually being asked to do, that more intermittent nature. When I first started working within football, Hoff's work was quite popular, and we would traditionally do these 4 minutes on, 3 minutes off type running drills around the edge of the training ground again, we're knowing that this is going to give us a physiological base. So it's going to give us a physiological base to develop that aerobic capacity. But again, in terms of that path of least resistance, which I mentioned early on, it's sometimes a hard sell to a professional footballer or a footballer in general. They want to see a ball in training. They want to see activities where it looks more like the game to them. Sometimes it's hard to explain to an athlete around, okay, well, you're going to spend a lot of time in a game without the ball. So can we upskill you in these kind of aerobic areas? We know they're going to have an impact, but potentially there's easier ways or better ways that we can potentially get these adaptations through our training. But we know that 3 to 4 minutes of work, multiple sets, will have an adaptation to our from an aerobic capacity. So some really basic examples. Again, I could have put up 101 ways that we could run around a football pitch, but 2 examples would have an envelope run. So essentially we're running some long sides, some short sides, so there's still some change of direction, 2 to 5 reps of 3 minutes, 2 minutes active recovery between reps. And then we've got these M runs. Again, there's slightly more changes of direction in here, but 2 to 5 reps, 3 minutes, 2 minutes recovery. We're not reinventing the wheel here. They're all quite basic activities. Essentially, we're just ensuring these athletes are working for around 3 minutes or 3 to 4 minutes with some active recovery for multiple repetitions. So kind of, as I said earlier on, when I was saying around that path of least resistance, and can we not just play the game? So in an ideal world, small-sided games would be my one and only choice for aerobic development. The problem that we face, and hopefully when we get into a bit of discussion or question and answers towards the end, is that players can potentially sometimes not hide, but if you're a central defender, you'll play as a defender in a small-sided game and you won't complete as much distance or work at as a high enough intensity during those small-sided games, or the pitch sizes might not be appropriate to elicit some sort of technical adaptation, and we might just get these physicals and vice versa. So it's how we best plan them. In the role I currently work at Wales, we track everything in terms of comparing it to our match demands. So as I said earlier on, in the female game, we know worst case scenario, 140 meters per minute is what we're asking these athletes to be able to do. These are our durations. So this is active time during the session. So that session might have been 80 to 90 minutes long, but only 40 minutes of it was active drill time. And then those percentages are essentially where we're seeing those, are we reaching game demands? And as you can see within our training, even with our 11v11 across the squad, we didn't quite hit those peak game demands that we see during the game. So we may be getting some adaptation from an aerobic standpoint, but we're not actually hitting game demands or exceeding game demands, so that when it comes to the match play is more intense than what we're used to in training. So a way around that, essentially we found, or it's been noted around this in terms of Dan Baker's work around high intensity aerobic interval training. So it's an applied method to assess aerobic capacity. It can be used as an aerobic conditioning method. So this can be done, a 1K time trial, a 1200 meter run, a 5 meter run, it can be anything up to a 12-minute Cooper run, which people may have done at school many, many years ago. I quite like the 1K time trial. A football pitch is approximately 100 meters long. So it's essentially 10 lengths of the football pitch. Say we did that in 4 minutes. We divide that 1,000 meters by 240 seconds, and that will give us 4.2 meters per second. From that, we can then create some training modalities based off that individual's individualized mass or maximal aerobic speed score. So we'll often group our athletes. So as you can see here, this is the Eurofit method, really simple training modality. As I said, that bang for our buck, large amounts of work done quite quickly, can be done within a training session. So approximately 100 to 130% of our maximal aerobic speed, 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off. So 15 seconds of active work, 15 seconds of passive recovery. 6 to 12 reps, 1 to 4 sets, approximately 2 minutes between sets of recovery. And as you say there, the less aerobically capable you are, the less distance you're going to run, and the more aerobically capable you are, the further you're going to run during those sessions. To be honest, that's probably one of the most common tools I use as a quick aerobic hit within football, in most intermittent team sports. Another option is this maximal aerobic grid. So this is you'll run the long sides, which is 100% of your maximum aerobic speed. And then the other, kind of the short side, is almost an active recovery, 70% of your maximum aerobic speed. Again, 15 seconds to run the long side, 15 seconds to run the short side, 6 to 12 reps, 1 to 4 sets. You're obviously going to gradually build that in, and probably most likely to use this within a pre-season block. And then for me, combining technical and tactical play alongside these mass style conditioning may be an effective tool to elicit aerobic outcome alongside team development. So having, a 5-6 minute block of maximum aerobic speed work coupled with small sided games or possession drills or football team based activities, for me, can be a really effective way to have some conditioning within our training sessions, opposed to it just be a standalone session. And again, that path of least resistance, keeping our players bought into these sessions to, again, elicit some aerobic development, develop them as a team, and then hopefully work towards that performance, which is where we're trying to get to. Well, that's all of my slides. So look forward to some questions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Luke. Really interesting, nice snapshot of some examples of different types of training and some concepts that some people might be aware of, others might not, such as maximal aerobic speed. And what you've done really nicely there, Luke, I don't know if it was intentional, but you've managed in my opinion, you've answered quite a few of the questions within that presentation. But what we'll do, we'll whiz through these, and if anyone in the audience wishes to ask a question, then type it into the chat, and if we have time, we'll go to that towards the end. So I'll start with the first question that came from Archan, and this is: what are the common approaches to improve both cardiovascular endurance and muscular endurance in football?
Nice. So hopefully some of that is started to be kind of answered in the questions, and I think the big thing to think about when we're thinking about football-based athletes is the concurrent nature of what we're asking them to do. I think it's if we are giving them kind of a cardiovascular or endurance-based stimulus and then a muscular endurance-based stimulus, we're kind of adding fatigue on fatigue. So often we get is a blunting effect of those two stimuluses, and we kind of don't get anywhere with them. So there'll be times in a season where we will be focused on aerobic or cardiovascular endurance or development, but our strength training modalities will probably be a much lower volume. There may be max strength or power development, so that we're not, as I said, blunting those two modalities. And then vice versa, we might have a muscular endurance or a hypertrophy based training modality, but then the volume in terms of our running or our on pitch or aerobic development will be a much lower level. So traditionally we'll see those muscular endurance or those hypertrophy type blocks carried out in an off-season period where there is no demands on the athlete in terms of a running based kind of stimulus. So hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. And also, would I be right in thinking that your conditioning sessions, some of which you described there, are going to catch both of those? Because in football, in my experience, muscular endurance is not usually the limiting factor for a player. So players aren't able to perform just because they get peripheral fatigue. It's usually because their aerobic fitness is inadequate. So doing that type of conditioning session, you're probably going to hit both of those things anyway.
You're going to get that central and peripheral adaptation from doing those kind of sessions 100%.
Cool. Okay, I'll go on to the next one, which is from Johnny. And again, this is something you alluded to in your slides there. Do you still think there's a place for long distance running for footballers to develop endurance in the off season?
I think the big word there is off season. And I think it's definitely an option and definitely a way that we can do it. But hopefully you could have seen from what I presented, it kind of isn't truly replicating the demands which we're placing those athletes in, placing on those athletes within the game or within training. So out of season 100%, I think there's definitely merit for those longer distance runs, building that base for those athletes to come back into pre-season. Really interestingly, during COVID, actually, we had obviously we had nothing. You know, I was working with the Welsh Football Association at the time, and some of our players who were at clubs had no access to any equipment, essentially. So very quickly, it was before athletes could get equipment sent out to them. In terms of that, maintaining an aerobic base, intermittent 1K efforts or 2K efforts or a 5K run, they were used. But in terms of if we go to a normal situation, and again go back to that path of least resistance and keeping players engaged and keeping players brought into the program, I think there's probably more effective and more efficient ways that we can get an adaptation from our athletes that we want, but also potentially get something else at the same time.
Yeah, I think that answers that really nicely and succinctly. But what are your thoughts on not so much long distance approaches, but more, so we say, things that you might have seen 10, 15 years ago in football, and maybe it still goes on now in the lower leagues, but sort of like classic sessions, which are kind of hard running, like shuttle runs, running up the stairs in stadiums and that type of thing. Does that still go on in at the elite level?
Really interesting. I was actually, it must have been a couple of weeks ago, I was reading an article about Sean Dyche when he was at Burnley, and every year he would run what he called Manager's Day. And it was a quote from the article, and it essentially said that sports science and tracking or anything just basically went out the window. And it was 2.5 hours of the manager essentially testing those players physically and psychologically. And again, it may not fit in with a scientific narrative, but sometimes I think those sessions can be really effective, as long as we're not damaging our athletes or potentially causing them emotional, physical harm. I think they can be really effective in terms of, and I'm not saying we do these every day all the time, but they can be really effective in terms of like unifying a team. We're all in this together. When the chips are down and time's hard, we've got each other's backs. We know that we are capable. I think there is a place for that interspersed within a more structured training environment. And
do you think, well, you kind of touched on it there, maybe it develops some, not necessarily just physical qualities, but psychologically some camaraderie, and there's like you just said there, sort of we're all in this together, and that sort of drill sergeant approach, while it shouldn't be used in season or excessively, then there might be time and place for it in the off season.
I think, as you said, it's a time and place. It's not all the time. I think you have to understand your athletes and have a really good understanding of where they are physically, what they can cope with, before we were to able to potentially deliver one of those sessions. And I was just thinking about my personal training. I'm training for a marathon currently, and it's horrible. And I always think about it's top 2 inches, like your brain gives in, or your mind gives in before your body. So it's sometimes a reminder of that in a more applied environment. Potentially there is a case for that.
And actually on this theme, I'm going to skip on to a question which, if I remember rightly, it came in quite late, but I think it's quite relevant to this theme, and that came from Jag, and he asked, do you use competitive conditioning drills such as shuttle races? And sort of that fits in with this theme.
100%. I think so. On training camps that I run, all of our camps are 10 days long. We have 2 international fixtures during each camp. So on a match day -2, before our first game, so it's usually our Wednesday, we play on a Friday evening, we do a max velocity day. So I'll have kind of do some drills, A skip, B skip type activities, some wicket runs, and we'll always then finish with some max velocity exposure, 2 to 3 bouts of trying to expose those athletes to the max V. I don't think you can get that if it's non-competitive. Athletes need to feel it to be, if I'm just going to say to you, Paul, now run as fast as you can from A to B, it's probably not going to happen. If you're being chased or you're racing someone, then you're probably going to run faster. Make it that competitive, try and make it enjoyable. We do relay races, baton type relay type activities, different start positions, chasing. I think there's such an important place for that. I think the warm-ups that I run with football-based athletes, I try and make them as enjoyable as possible. And one of the ways is competitive races. It's, for me, such an important thing to do.
And would you apply the same for when it comes to trying to find maximal aerobic speed, like you said there? So, for example, in something like a Cooper 12-minute run or a 1K time trial, I guess that there are problems with it because it could throw people's pacing off. But at the same time, you've got that competition, which may give someone, a little bit of an emphasis to go a bit quicker, and then you get a more accurate estimation of their MAS.
Yeah, 100%. I think, as you said, it's not like saying let's go all out from the off, because people, I'm not sure if any people on the call have ever tried to do a 12-minute Cooper run as fast as they can, or do a 1K time trial as fast as they can. What you find is on a 1K, particularly 300 meters in, you're spent because you've gone out too hard. So definitely it can impact pacing. But, I think a bit of competition is quite enjoyable. Potentially if you've got some previous data on athletes, you'll rank them, say your top 10 go in the first group, your second 10 go in the second group. So they're racing against people, or not racing, essentially running alongside people of a similar fitness level to them. And that can potentially help drive that MAS up, make it more competitive, make them work a little bit harder. I think there's there's ways and means to constrain the practice to ensure that we get the data we want, and potentially, if it becomes a little bit competitive, becomes a little bit more enjoyable as well.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And as you said there, if you just set someone out on a run on an empty track, they're probably not going to get or cover as much distance as they would if they were kind of trying to catch up with someone or get away from someone. So that makes perfect sense. We'll go on to the next question from Kieran, and you did answer this, I think, within your slides, but it'll be interesting to maybe go into a bit more depth. And his question is, how do you set the intensity of conditioning sessions? Do you use MAS, which is maximal aerobic speed?
So in a nutshell, MAS is, for me, probably one of the most kind of user-friendly intensity measures that we have as practitioners within the field. So as long as you have an MAS score, so you've run some sort of time trial, you understand what that athlete's predicted it, or their MAS in terms of meters per second is, that will give you a really good way to prescribe training. So a lot of Dan Baker's work essentially stated that when we're working over 100% of our MAS, so basically, 101 and above, we're eliciting more kind of aerobic development, and it's also a kind of, again, that bang for your buck. I find, though, if we go over 130%, it just becomes repeated speed, and particularly in athletes that maybe not used to repeated high intensity running, it becomes a bit of a waste of time because athletes aren't making their prescribed distances. I find kind of that 105 to 115, 120% is probably the most effective tool. I also quite like having a change of direction element in there. But again, what you always have to bear in mind is when we have a change of direction element, we've got an acceleration, a deceleration, and a reacceleration. So that's going to impact the amount of distance that athletes are going to be able to cover. So again, that impacts your percentage of MAS you want to work at. So you probably need to drop it down if you're going to add in changes of direction to that. In terms of more, say, game-based style drills, so if we're playing small-sided games, for example, I try and run live GPS. So again, some people may have access to that, lots of people won't, it's just, as in, just to give you a little bit of an example, we'll try and manipulate our drill so that we are trying to get to in and around the demands of our game. So we know that that's around 140 meters per minute. So we'll run the drill live, and we'll try and ensure that we drive the intensity upwards of that 140 meters per minute. The way we do it is change pitch size, potentially making it larger, so there's more distance to cover, reduced player number, so again increases the distance that each player would have to cover. Multi-ball, I find fantastic for that. The ball's never out of play, as the coach will always have two balls within their arms, so that if the ball goes out of play, we've got a ball basically straight away in play. Take keepers away sometimes is really effective. Just have end zones, keepers slow down play. So that's again going to drive that intensity up towards that 140 meters per minute, which is kind of relevant to the women's game.
That's really interesting, because that's another question that came up on, do you use small-sided games? So you've answered that. And a question I've got then is, because obviously that blends the technical side with conditioning.
Yeah.
I mean, have you ever had issues whereby you're trying to get a physiological or physical stimulus and the quality of the football maybe isn't as great as you'd want it? So then is there any ever issues with sort of the tactical coaches in those instances?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So I work with a head coach now. She's fantastic, really buys into sports science, strength conditioning. So the Welsh women's national team head coach is a coach called Gemma Granger, phenomenally experienced in terms of international football, and we have a really good working relationship. So in terms of that tactical coaches impacting on the potential physical stimulus, we have a really simple RAG rating in terms of how we're rating a drill, or even maybe just a rep of a drill. So say we're doing a small-sided game and we're going to do 4 reps. So say it's a new way of playing, a new game. That first block we'd class as a teach drill, so it would be green in nature. So we know that the physical hit is going to take a hit at that point, essentially. So there might be some teaching, some stop starts, the players learning the drill. So we may not get anywhere near that, 140 meters per minute. We have this bit in the middle, we call it refine, so it's an amber, where coaches are still allowed to intervene, but on a much reduced emphasis. We're trying to start to dial up that physical quality. And then we have our red drills, our compete drills. They're competitive in nature, and wherever possible. And ultimately, I'm not the national team head coach, so if they need tactical, technical explanation, then that can happen, and we'll worry about the physical at another point in time. But if we're driving physical and we want to just let the drill play, hopefully as coaches we step back and we just let the game go. If we don't find that we've still not hit that physical stimulus, that's where our MAS or our kind of box-to-box type runs will come in, where we can almost top up the physical stimulus if we haven't quite elicited it during the small-sided game.
Cool. That's exactly what I was just about to ask you there, because you mentioned it in your slides earlier that one of the issues with small-sided games is that potentially you might not get the right dose of training for some players. So you might overcook some players, and some might not get the stimulus. So in your experience, how often would you have to sort of top players up after using a small-sided games approach?
So I guess it depends on when it will be. So in pre-season, I probably more would have, set metrics for each athlete and what we want to try and get them in terms of accumulated total distance, high speed running, accelerations, decelerations during a session. So there may be a notion to top athletes up during that period of time. And again, from an international standpoint, we've got currently 16 different clubs represented within our national team squad. They obviously have 16 different ways of training. So when they come into a centralized model, some athletes may need to do more to almost keep them on an even keel for when they go back to their club environment. So lots of athletes will come and ask me, what are my numbers for the day? Where am I sitting in terms of my high speed running or my total distance? And then we may top them up towards the end of the session in terms of that kind of high intensity distance or running based distance during the session. And on the flip side of that, and it's really, I find the use of GPS obviously has exploded within football in particular, given the money or finances available within football. Practitioners can sometimes become risk averse, and we review a session, or we've got the session live, and Paul, you're my central midfielder and you've done 5 meters too much of high speed running.
Chance to be a fine thing, Luke.
And at that point, some practitioners may be like, wow, you've done too much, we've increased your injury risk, the world's going to end because you've done 5 meters too much. For me, I think that's quite risk averse. We don't know potentially what your physical capabilities are. We just have some historical data on you. And Joe Clubb, fantastic sports science practitioner, and people listening, I'd strongly advocate you go and have a look at some of her work. She wrote a consensus paper with a big group of practitioners who all work in elite sport called More Than a Metric, and how we manage all of the data that we collect as practitioners. And one of the big take homes from her was, from the group, was around that risk averse nature around training. So it almost goes back to that Sean Dyche mentality. Let's truly understand what our players are capable, or our athletes are capable of, before we're restricting them, putting the shackles back on. And I think that comes back to my end goal as a practitioner, is to support the head coach and the technical staff to ensure that we win football matches. And if that involves them to have more time on a training field, we'll try and accommodate that. I think that's a really important message to kind of always have at the back of our mind.
Do you think GPS in particular has fed into that risk averse
100%
nature?
100%. So again, young practitioner, myself, 2007, I started working in sport, or working in football. We had nothing at the time. It would be an RPE, and that would be, after the event. And if it was a 9 or a 10, we'd we need to probably do a little bit less tomorrow. Then fast forward a couple more years, and I was fortunate enough to get a Polar Team 2, like the original heart rate system. Yeah, brilliant. Slowest, used to take hours to download some heart rate traces, and by that point, it probably wasn't very beneficial. And even the data, how many minutes we spent in those red zones as coaches, what use was that? And then early GPS, those 1 hertz systems that were flaky at best, in and out of, and now we're at our kind of catapult vector S7s, fantastic pieces of kit, gives us unbelievable data, but it's how we manipulate it, and the narrative us as practitioners provide. And again, it's that risk averse nature. So I'm very conscious of, I try and compare everything to the end goal, which is match play, what are the match demands, but also what are our worst case scenarios, and can we potentially train hard, fight easy. And we're not going to train hard every day. We'll have hard days, and can they be very, very hard? And then, we're going to have light days where they're going to be very, very light. And we might go back to that RAG rating. On those light days, it might be lots of teach. It might be lots of those green drills where it's lots of education and feeding in tactical and technical information. But on those red days, let's see if we can push the dial a little bit and see what our athletes are capable of.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's where striking a balance between the technology and the metrics you get, and also whilst not trying to lose sort of the feel for coaching and training prescription, because there are other technologies which can also probably feed into that sort of risk aversion things. When we start looking at things like heart rate variability and monitoring sleep and that type of thing, it can almost become a case of paralysis by analysis. You kind of don't know where to turn or what to do because you've got so much data. But I suppose that's really the skill of sort of the modern sports scientist and S&C coach, is being able to use that data but not lose that intuition for coaching and training prescription.
100%. So I feel very fortunate, so that my direct boss or manager at the Football Association of Wales is a guy called Tony Strudwick. So Tony Strudwick was Alex Ferguson's strength and conditioning coach for about 20 years, multiple Champions League titles, Premier Leagues, FA Cups. He's been in the professional game for upwards of 25 years, and he actually talks about this as a really good talk he did for Catapult, which is really interesting because Catapult are selling GPS units around, essentially, as young practitioners or developing practitioners, it's fantastic that we understand and know how to use technology. We understand how to manipulate GPS data or HRV, or we take force plate jump scores of a morning to look at freshness versus fatigue. Unbelievably important skills to have, but let's not get, as you said, paralysis by analysis. Let's not get lost in the data, and remember that we are coaches first and foremost. So our communication skills with our athletes, our communication skills with our coaching staff is the most important thing. Asking an athlete how they are is as effective as a HRV or a count movement jump. If you've got a good relationship with them, they're going to tell you they're honest the way they feel. And also, again, when we're watching a drill or we're creating a drill in a gym or on a pitch, understanding or knowing what those drills should look like and should feel like is as important as what the metrics say.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this actually goes towards without trying to go off on too much of a tangent, but something recently I've spoken to a few people about, and that's sort of the whole concept of fatigue. So like in physiology, fatigue is usually defined as the muscle force production, and we look at it in sort of like a silo that you mentioned earlier, but looking at it more holistically, there are different types of fatigue, and one of those you just mentioned is sort of perceived fatigue as well, which I think can be equally as important as fatigue that we can measure in the lab as well. And you can only really get that through asking an athlete how they feel and how fatigued they are, and also what the source of their fatigue is. I mean, fatigue from muscular fatigue due to, I know, doing a lot of eccentric training is a lot different to the fatigue that you might get if you just chronically overtrained. So it's being able to differentiate between those things as well. But anyway, that's probably a talk for another time. I'll go on to a question which kind of alludes to your previous point about sort of top-up training.
Yeah.
And that is from Andy. He says, what does a typical session look like after a game for players who haven't had much, if any, game time? So just for the audience, you might, if you're watching the World Cup at the moment, and when the pundits are doing their post-match analysis, you might see in the background some players are still on pitch, and they're probably substitutes or players that haven't had much game time. So this question is about essentially what are they doing?
So it's really interesting. So again, I've kind of tussled with the best way to get this done pretty much my entire professional career. I'm still not 100% sure on the best way to get it done. So immediately post-game, the day after a game, traditionally athletes will have the day off. So they really want their day off, whether they've played or not. You know, seeing your family, seeing your friends, seeing your children, wherever it might be, is so important, and probably the most effective way to recover. When I worked in club environments, I would never like to bring players in on the day after a game for recovery, because sitting on a spin bike and doing some foam rolling when they may have to travel an hour, for me, is really ineffective. Just go for a walk with your family. It's a much better way to recover. But that's a little bit of a side topic. But I have done top-up sessions or blowouts immediately post-game and also the day after. And I'm still kind of flipping between the two. Immediately post-game, you face one big factor, and that's groundsmen. Groundsmen want you off the pitch. As soon as a game ends, they want you nowhere near it. Warm-ups before a game, they hate, and top-ups, blowouts at the end of the game, they also hate. So that's the first thing to consider. So if you've got a groundsman who wants you off the pitch, wants you off the pitch quickly, it's what you can do most of the least. So the way I would often run that is, and again, groundsmen sometimes don't even want a ball out, so it's just straight line running. We will try and top up as close as we can to the high speed running that player would traditionally complete during a game. So if you are a wide midfielder, you may complete anywhere between 600 meters and 1,000 meters of high speed running. The easiest way we can get that is a box to box run or a touchline to halfway line run, work to rest ratio 1-to-1, and we'll probably get that done in 15 minutes. Some groundsmen, particularly in Eastern Europe, are a little bit more friendly and a little bit more flexible. So when this year we've been to places, Estonia, Slovenia, Serbia, Kazakhstan, they were all much more willing that we could run a bit more of a session post-game. So I would combine, again, we're getting a bit more buy-in with the players. I worked with one of our assistant coaches. We would run a possession type drill, multi-directional. So they're getting that kind of mechanical loading, acceleration, deceleration. Through a possession-based drill, they're also using a ball. So we're getting that buy-in. And then we'll couple that with some high-speed or high-intensity interval running. So that is on the day of the game. From that, it means that players can have the next day off traditionally. And then
just a quick one on that. Is that just with unused subs, or is it what's
no,
the
it's a really good point.
point?
So again, it depends. So if we're working, say go to a club environment, anything below the or even the Premier League, if you're playing in Europe, you're playing Saturday, Tuesday, Saturday, Wednesday, forever. You might have a player who plays 90 minutes on a Saturday, 30 minutes on a Tuesday. Well, that Tuesday, they've played less than 45 minutes or 50 minutes, whatever you decide your cut-off is. Traditionally, we use kind of 45 to 60 minutes as our cut-off. But they played 90 minutes 3 days ago. So I'm probably not going to worry about topping them up. They're in a good position. But if it's a player who is traditionally a sub or a finisher and they only ever play 20 to 30 minutes, then I will look at what they've done. We'll run GPS live and we'll say, you've covered 200 meters of high speed running when you normally cover 800 meters in a game. So we top them up to where they're at. That's sometimes a harder sell to the players because they've finished the game. They either have won and they're very happy, or they've lost and they're less happy. So dragging them out to do some conditioning is quite difficult, but it's a modality I've used. And then if we don't do it immediately post-game, some places don't like us to do it, or some players don't want their players on pitch post-game, we might run it the following morning. Players much prefer this in my experiences, because what you get post the next day is you have all the time in the world. You'll have more technical, tactical input. It's less sports science heavy. And what we'll try and do in those sessions, max velocity exposures during our warm-ups. Again, that mechanical loading and tactical, technical work through kind of possession-based drills. And then we'll play traditionally high-intensity small-sided games. So a game I really like to play from a conditioning output, we call it the Wave. It's a large pitch size, and it essentially will run 1v the goalkeeper, 2v1, 3v2, 4v3, 4v4, 5v5, 5v5. So essentially the player number grows and it's very transitional. And then obviously just you do a few rounds, making sure it's not always the same person who starts the drill and it is in every rep. I find that the most explosive and the most distance we get from our small-sided games is that kind of wave practice where it's very transitional in nature. So we'll do some bouts of that and then give some athletes an opportunity to do some kind of individual development with a technical coach. So they're getting some technical and technical development in smaller groups, as well as getting this conditioning hit. So I find that being a much more effective way to top players up, keep them on board, and also improving them technically and tactically.
And on that, that's really interesting insight. Do you do in-season sort of monitoring or testing where you can tell if a player maybe is detraining or even improving their fitness?
So essentially, yes, we will do. So if we're looking at max velocity exposures, we'll run GPS. So we'll look at how fast they are in terms of meters per second. So we'll look at a track around that. I found the 1K time trial, you can do that in a training session and it's not going to have too much of a physiological cost on the athlete, or much of a cost in terms of time. So in lots of teams I've worked in, we'll run kind of in-season aerobic capacity kind of checkups almost. That one helps us with our conditioning prescription because our MAS scores may have changed, but it also just shows us where we are in terms of a group. A 1K time trial can take anywhere between 3 and 5 minutes. It's, an extension of a warm-up almost. It's a really effective way to carry that out. I've also done like sub-max yo-yos where it's a sub-maximal yo-yo. So if people have done a yo-yo test here, so a maximal yo-yo when you're running those 20-meter shuttles with a 5-meter recovery. Also done a sub-max yo-yo with a heart rate strap, and we're looking at how quickly an athlete can recover from a sub-maximal activity. Potentially an easier sell than a 1K time trial because it's not maximal intensity, but it requires our athletes to ensure we're wearing a heart rate belt and we can turn that data around effectively.
Cool. That's really interesting. Thanks for that. Okay, couple more questions then. From Jay, we'll go with roughly what percentage of your training time consists of small-sided games? And I think you alluded to this in your last answer, but he also asked, do you have a favorite small-sided game format for improving match fitness?
So in terms of how a training week might look, in terms of my current situation, it's international football. So we're almost a little bit more skewed to that tactical. It's where the players need to get the tactical information ready for match play, but we'll still have small-sided elements to it. And again, when I was in club environments, we'd have small-sided elements. But ultimately, the way a normal training day or training structure might look would be kind of a warm-up into some sort of warm-up extension, a possession drill, some sort of phase of play, tactical, technical development, bringing that into an 11v11. So at senior level, we spend a lot of time in 11v11 phases of play. At youth level, we might spend a lot less time there, but sticking towards the senior end. And then normally we'll finish every session with a variation of a small-sided game. One, it keeps tempo high. Players love to play small-sided games, and we can get conditioning output from it. So a couple I really like, as I said, the wave game, which I've already explained. And then I really like a game called Best in Both Boxes, where we'll run 4 teams, 2 teams on the pitch, 2 teams on the outside. The teams on the outside act as bounce players, so the ball is never out of play. We run over 2 18-yard boxes, and it's a really effective way to get a conditioning output from our players.
And I guess one of the advantages as well, at least as I see it, when you do small-sided games, is that you get those sort of duels, which you obviously don't with straight line running drills. But in my experience, both as not a very good player, but as a player, and when setting sessions, it's those sort of duels and those one-on-one and tackling, and which really seems to kind of cause massive spikes in heart rate and takes a while to recover from. So I guess you get that more match specific component to, or aerobic challenge, shall we say?
Yeah, 100%. I think, as you said, it's that match specific, those duels. So the head coach I work with, she loves the phrase of like, stay in the duel. So stay in the duel, stay in that 1v1 for as long as you possibly can. And I think, as you said, those small-sided games promote it more than potentially the 11v11 kind of drills would do. So it's a really effective way to get a tactical, technical outcome as well as a physical stimulus. And
we're almost up on time, Luke, but the one question I've just seen has come through in the chat. If you wouldn't mind answering this one. This one's from Stefan, and he asks, is there a higher risk of injury when doing the high intensity aerobic pitch work in male or female populations? It's an interesting one.
No, really, really interesting. And something I speak to quite a lot of physios that I work with currently, and obviously there's been a reported increase in ACL injuries within the women's game. I don't know if there actually has been an increase, or the fact that we know a lot more about female international footballers or female professional footballers than we did 5-10 years ago. These injuries probably still existed at that time. They just weren't reported in the same way. I don't think there's an increased risk for males or females as long as they're trained to do what we're asking the athletes to do. So if we go back to that early example of the Sean Dyche Managers Day, if our athletes aren't at a physical level to cope with excessive repeated high intensity bouts, male, female, young, old, then they're going to get injured. So are we physically preparing our athletes for the demands of the training that we're asking them to do? And that comes to any athlete in any sport, really. It's have we prepped them effectively to complete what we're asking them to do? But then it links back to the point from Joe Clubb around being risk averse. So it's almost that balancing act of, okay, we know we're here, but we want to maybe try a little bit higher today, but we don't know if they can cope with it, but we'll never know unless we try. So it's a kind of, as I said, a bit of a balancing act. Same as lots of things in sports science. It's the nuances, it's the context, it's the narrative that we learn and understand as coaches, and we learn and understand our athletes.
Yeah, so I suppose that's the issue with having sort of, although they're grounded in science and data and modelling, they're having arbitrary sort of cut-off points is problematic because every player's an individual, and some can tolerate higher loads than others. So having sort of red, amber and green zones, that needs to be individualized, doesn't it? Which is really problematic. You've got to collect a lot of data to do that, and even then it's a moving target, isn't it, as their fitness improves?
Yeah, everything's going to be, it can be fluctuating over a block of training, or it can even fluctuate day to day based on the kind of that fitness versus fatigue that we, hopefully we've spoke to our athletes, we're asking how they are, we've collected some objective data, or we know what a tough day looks for them normally, or when they're fresh, but now actually a tough day is a lot less intense than it should be because they're struggling physically, psychologically, or vice versa. Our athletes have come in absolutely flying and they're morning monitoring today. Their mood scores are through the roof, their stress scores are down, their physical outputs are really high on whatever objective monitoring we're going to do. And okay, let's push the dial a little bit today. Let's make life a little bit difficult for them and see what happens.
Yeah, because I guess that's ultimately how you get a training response, isn't it? If you don't overload, then you stagnate. So it's it's a really interesting balance. Probably one for another webinar, I think. Interesting subject. But we've just gone past the hour, Luke. So just wanted to say thanks very much for giving up your time to do this, and particularly putting some slides together. I think that was really interesting to have a quick snapshot of sort of some of the things you do and some of the methods you use. I'm glad we got to at least one live question as well. So thanks very much for your time, Luke.